Hello, my name is Doug Webb, and I wanted to present a quick demonstration of how Ansible and some of its capabilities with respect to host and network automation work. Ansible is an agentless tool, which basically means you do not have to install any dependencies, tools, languages, or libraries on your targeted endpoints. It works well when running on Linux, and that is what I will be using today for this demonstration. I installed Ansible on Ubuntu an Ubuntu 20.04 desktop virtual machine, which will serve as my Ansible controller. The virtual machine is hosted on a Type 1 hypervisor called Proxmox, which uses QEMU to host VMs and is free software to use, and that's this environment here. For my endpoints, I am using the GNS3 network emulator and running a simple setup consisting of Cisco switches and routers plus a few endpoint Ubuntu PCs, as you can see in this diagram. It is important to note that all of these virtual endpoints are configured for SSH, which is the primary connection Ansible uses to communicate with targets, and all endpoints are on the same subnet as the Ansible controller, allowing it to communicate without interrupting data plane traffic. Alright, let's go back to Proxmox. Alright, let's start by talking about some of the default files Ansible comes with. By default, when installing Ansible, your default directory will be in the etc Ansible file directory. So that will be I'm actually going to open a new terminal here. Okay. I prefer to, even though this is the default directory which Ansible gives you upon installation, I prefer to create my own directory, which I did here, and made a directory of code and sandbox subdirectory. So what you would do is, from your default directory, simply copy the default files or just create your own and ensure your permissions are correct to execute from your preferred directory, which I have already done. So from here, if you look at this directory, you can see that I have already taken some of the default files and copied them over, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Alright, so for this, even though you could use terminal, that's fine, but I prefer to use a text editor. I'm using VS Code for my text editor, which enables me to easily read files, plus comes with nice extensions for specific languages such as Cisco iOS and YAML, which we'll see in a moment. I prefer to use this as YAML is pretty picky about spacing, so writing inside a terminal can get confusing if you're not perfect with your spacing. And debugging is already a limitation with Ansible, so the less you have to do, the better. Let's start first with the Ansible configuration file. This is a big one. As you can see, I have listed a few key things I need Ansible to do for me. First, I have told it where to look for my hosts. So my inventory is here. Then I tell Ansible not to check for host keys, as I already have them identified and do not need to do that every single time I run a playbook. So I set this to false. Let's see. I do not want Ansible retrying plays, so if they fail. So the next line defers that capability, which is here. Set that to false. By default, Ansible will attempt to gather facts about its targets, which takes time. So I'm setting the variable to explicit, which negates that happening during each play. If you intend to reuse code, roles can really help. So in the next line, I am telling Ansible where to look for that reusable code. Ansible is built on Python, so I am telling it which version to use, which is identified here. Ansible also produces warnings of deprecated code, which may be used on occasion, and I would prefer not to see these warnings, so I'm going to set this guy to false right here. I then set my SSH timeout to 60 seconds to give Ansible some time to run its course. And lastly and optionally, I set the network module to iOS since I am using Cisco IOS virtual nodes. Let's see. As I said before, Ansible uses SSH to connect, but I also want to I want it to use secure copy to transfer files from the controller to its targets. So I will set that method to SCP. Lastly, I set connect and command timeouts to 120 seconds to give Ansible time to do its thing when transferring and configuring larger files. So that's here. Now let's look at the second big one, which is our host file. All right. This is a very powerful file with a plethora of options, and I consider it to be one of the more important files in Ansible, which is why you want to protect it, and I will talk about that at the end of this presentation. As you can see, this is where I'm able to separate my targeted hosts into their own groups and name those hosts, or name those groups. Here, I have my routers, switches, and PCs separated into their own groups. I have identified their out-of-band management IP addresses, which the Ansible controller will use to communicate with them. And for like devices in which I want to configure as multiple groups, I have listed them as children to a parent group and named it. So as you can see here, I have my parent group and its children are my subgroups. Okay. Let's see. For my Linux PCs, I have set some additional variables for Ansible to look for inside some of its playbooks and can be reused as needed. There are plenty of options for additional variables inside this file if you wanted them, but I'm going to talk about a separate place for those variables next. Just understand that Ansible is way versatile in these situations and does a great job parsing for information when seeking out targeted information related to your targeted hosts. All right, moving on. We're going to go to our group vars directory. All right. This is a great place to detail information relating to specific groups listed in your host file. One major thing to note is that Ansible is picky about the names of your group vars. So if you list group A as group A in your host file, so in other words, if this was group A, then you're going to want your group var's name to be group A, okay? So, as you can see here, I name my group var files exactly how they're listed in my host file. So Ansible knows exactly where to grab this information. All right. Okay. In our Linux PC group variable, I am identifying my user and pass credentials and also telling Ansible that I need to be a sudo user as well. Pretty straightforward, and this is also one of those files we will want to protect when we are done with it. Next is my routers, which I have added some additional variables such as connection type, SSH arguments likely to be encountered, the network operating system that we're going to use, and a specific interface used for out-of-band management, which is here. Okay. My switches are the same, just with a different out-of-band management interface. Ansible will use all of this information when running its plays on the targeted devices. Okay, so now that we have discussed our setup, let me briefly talk about how to protect your valued information such as your host file, which have your IP addresses, your group variables, which have your user and pass. It's simple. Just use Ansible Vault to encrypt these files. All right, so it's pretty simple. So if I wanted to use Ansible Vault, I would simply type Ansible Vault encrypt, and this is where I would target the file I would want to encrypt. So if I want to encrypt my host file, it's going to prompt me for a password. So this is where I put my password. I will confirm it, and now encryption is successful. All right, so if I go back on my controller to look at my host file, all I see is garble. All right, this is what hashes that data in place and protects from outside intrusion, which is important when you start talking about IP addresses and user and pass credentials and such. And if I want, there are several ways to view or edit it using Ansible Vault, but in this case, just to keep it simple, I'll let you read the documentation on that. But if I wanted to decrypt it, it is as simple as decrypt. Now I'll put my Vault password. Decryption is successful, and now I can view my file again. All right, that's simple. All right. Yeah, you can also add, these key files like your hosts and your group var files to a git ignore if you are regularly committing data to public repos and don't want that information transited. So, good practice to do there. And that will conclude the first part of this series. So we've briefly talked about our setup. The version I am running currently is 2.12.10, which may be deprecated, but it works for what I need it to do, so that is what I'm using. And again, we will conclude this now after talking about the key files and setup, and we will hop into playbooks into our next section.